moment Callie's family stepped into the engagement party, the entire ballroom froze. Not applause, only sharp stares and whispers heavy with contempt. The groom's mother hissed, "What a disgrace." And in front of hundreds of guests, Andrew, the man who was supposed to honor his bride, spat his verdict. "You deceived me. This is the blood you bring into my family." In seconds, what should have been a celebration turned into a public trial, with the bride's family mocked and condemned. But here's the twist. The man they humiliated held the power to destroy the groom's entire dynasty. And trust me, you're going to want to see how this night ends. Stick with us until the very last second, and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from in the comment. The moment Kaylee's family stepped into the ballroom, the groom's smile collapsed. Andrew froze mid-toast, his champagne flute hovering uselessly in the air, his eyes narrowing with something between disbelief and contempt. The hush that spread across his face was not awe, not tenderness, but the sour twist of a man who felt deceived. He leaned toward his bride, his voice sharp enough to slice through the velvet air of the evening. "So this is the secret you've been keeping," he hissed, his lips barely moving but his words landing like stones. "You let me walk into this engagement blind. You parade them into my family celebration and expect me to smile." His parents, positioned like sentinels behind him, followed his gaze and stiffened. Their expressions hardened with the brittle outrage of people convinced they'd been tricked. His mother's pearls rattled against her throat as she whispered to no one in particular, "God above, what a deception to hide blood like this." Andrew did not lower his voice. "If I had known," he snapped, so the nearest guests could hear, "if I had known your grandfather was a black man, I would have thought twice. But you," he jabbed a finger toward Kaylee, the bride who had not yet spoken, "you've humiliated me before my family, before this entire room, and you dare to stand here like nothing has been done wrong?" The words struck harder than any slap. It was only an engagement, not yet vows, but Andrew wielded accusation as though Judgment Day had arrived. His tone dripped with mockery, not of strangers, but of the woman he was meant to honor. Guests turned, whispers igniting like sparks, the chandeliers glinting as though eager to expose every flaw. Kaylee's face burned. She had hidden her family's truth not out of shame, but out of love. She had silenced her lineage, the black grandfather with eyes of iron and grace, the white grandmother who had stood beside him through decades of scorn. The empire they had built brick by brick, not because she feared judgment from the world, but because she feared Andrew's pride. She had wanted to spare him the humiliation of measuring himself against her grandfather's empire, against her family's unimaginable wealth. She had wanted him to love her stripped of status, believing they were equals. And yet here he stood, proving her fears were never misplaced. The silence that followed Andrew's outburst was broken not by reconciliation, but by cruelty. His mother's voice, sharp as broken glass, sliced across the ballroom. "Well," she said, her smile painted but brittle. No wonder she never mentioned them. Who could blame her? "We would never have approved." The words, dipped in condescension, floated through the air like poison, reaching every corner of the glittering hall. A ripple of gasps ran through the guests, some covering their mouths, others leaning in closer as though scandal were champagne to be sipped. Andrew's father folded his arms, his tuxedo straining against the tension in his chest. He scanned David with a look that pretended to be appraisal but reeked of disdain. "We built this evening to honor our family name," he intoned. "And here you bring what? A reminder of fields and sweat? We invited royalty and financiers, and now we are made to stand beside." He did not finish. He did not have to. The pause was deliberate, a silence that branded David and Kaylee's family with every ugly word left unsaid. David's eyes narrowed, not in shame, but in patience honed by decades of surviving such slights. He stood still, his hands folded loosely before him, his dignity intact, though arrows of prejudice flew at him from every angle. Beside him, his wife straightened her shoulders, her pale face glowing with quiet defiance. She had lived her life absorbing venom like this, but the sting never dulled. Andrew's aunt, dripping in emeralds that winked against her sagging skin, let out a laugh so brittle it could have shattered. "My dear," she cooed toward Andrew, though her eyes burned holes into Callie, "you could have had anyone." Why chain yourself to a family that dragged shadows into our light? Don't you see how the papers will feast on this? They'll call us backward, call us blind. Her laughter cracked again, this time meaner, the way people laugh not at humor, but at another's pain. The cruelty crescendoed. Andrew's cousin, a young man bloated with entitlement, leaned in close enough for his whisper to be heard by half the room. You'll never scrub it clean, he sneered, eyes darting toward David. Once that kind of blood is in, it stains forever. His words oozed with the arrogance of someone too sheltered to recognize his own ignorance, and yet they landed like a lash across the room. Kaylee's chest tightened. Each word, each smirk, each dagger disguised as civility pressed into her ribs until she thought she might collapse. Yet she did not move. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her gown, nails biting the silk, but she forced her chin higher. She wanted to scream the truth, to reveal that it was her grandfather's empire that funded the very corporations these self-proclaimed aristocrats worshipped. She wanted to strip away their smugness with one sentence. Without him, you would be nothing. But love still shackled her tongue. For Andrew, for the boy she once believed loved her beyond titles and bloodlines, she endured. But endurance had its limits, and the room itself seemed to shudder under the weight of the venom. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some recoiled from the ugliness on display. Others leaned in hungrily as though prejudice were theater. The chandeliers glittered overhead, their crystal arms refracting the cruelty like fractured light, illuminating every sneer, every curling lip, every darting, judgmental eye. Andrew, instead of defending the woman beside him, joined the chorus. They are right, he spat, his tone rich with betrayal. You should have told me. You've humiliated me before my parents, before everyone who matters. How could you expect me to stand beside you now, as though nothing were wrong? His hand gestured toward David as if pointing to the source of contamination. This is not what I signed up for. A hush fell. Even the cruelest of his relatives stilled, for Andrew had said aloud what they only dared imply. The rejection was complete, undeniable. It was not hidden in whispers or coated in etiquette. It was plain, brutal, and public. David finally lifted his gaze to meet Andrew's. His voice was low, steady, resonant with history. What you signed up for, he said, was love. What you stand for now is everything but. His words were not shouted, not sharp. They were heavy with truth, and for a heartbeat, the room quivered with its weight. But Andrew's mother laughed again, brittle and cruel. Love? Love does not pay for reputation. Love does not secure our place in society. She reached for her son's arm, as though to draw him back from the abyss of compassion. No, love is not enough, and certainly not this kind of love. The words rang through the hall, louder than the quartet, louder than the clinking of crystal, louder even than the whispers that ignited again. In that moment, the engagement was no longer a union. It was a spectacle, a trial staged beneath chandeliers, with the bride and her family in the dock and the groom's kin passing judgment. Carly stood trembling, her silence a scream unheard. The audience of guests felt the fracture ripple outward. Some eyes gleamed with disgust, others with fascination, but all were trapped in the theater of cruelty. The night had become a stage, and Prejudice the star performer. The cruelty was not quiet anymore. It was thunder, rolling through the marble, searing itself into memory, and as the music faltered and the lights blazed, everyone knew this night would not end in celebration, it would end in ruin. The air inside the ballroom grew heavier, as though the chandeliers themselves strained under the weight of silence. Every guest could feel it. The party had tilted from spectacle into something darker, a stage where cruelty would not only speak, but reign. Andrew stood at the center, his tuxedo gleaming, his posture rigid, his jaw carved with fury and calculation. He turned toward Carly, his fiancée, the woman in white beside him, and for a heartbeat it seemed he might relent, that reason might pull him back. But what emerged was a blade, sharpened with humiliation and sharpened further by pride. I cannot do this, he announced, his voice rising above the murmurs like a verdict. Not tonight, not ever. This engagement ends here. The words detonated across the marble hall. Gasps broke like glass. Champagne flutes slipped from stunned fingers, and the string quartet collapsed into silence mid-measure. Haley's breath caught, her hand instinctively reaching for stability, but there was none to be found. He had not whispered the decision in private. He had flung it into the air, weaponized, before the crowd, turning her heartbreak into theater. Andrew's mother pressed her hand to her pearls with a satisfaction too poorly concealed. His father nodded grimly, as though his son had just defended their dynasty rather than destroyed his bride's dignity. Whispers swirled among the guests, scandal feeding on itself. But Andrew was not finished. He would not simply walk away. He would scorch the earth as he left. I was misled, he continued, his voice echoing off the gilded ceilings. Deceived into believing this union could elevate our families together. Instead, I find myself shackled to secrets, to bloodlines that do not belong in this room. His eyes darted toward David, then back to Kelly, his words dripping with a mockery that cut deeper than shouting ever could. You thought love would cover it, didn't you? You thought hiding the truth would make me blind. But I see clearly now, and I choose to be free. The cruelty of it was not only in the rejection, but in the relish with which he performed it. He spoke not as a man undone by heartbreak, but as an actor savoring his lines before a captive audience. The chandelier light caught his face, illuminating not pain but ambition. And then, as if the humiliation of one woman were not enough, he unveiled the dagger he had concealed all along. There is another, Andrew declared, his lips curling into a smirk that sent shockwaves through the hall. Someone who understands her place, who comes from a family of worth, of standing. A woman whose name carries the weight and grace my family deserves. She has been there, waiting, watching, patient in her silence. And now she will take the place that was never meant for you. Have I said? The gasp that tore through the guests was almost physical, a wave that pressed against the walls. Some clutched their throats, others muttered prayers, others leaned forward hungry for the unfolding ruin. Callie's knees nearly buckled. Not only had he broken the engagement, he had confessed the betrayal that had shadowed their relationship. The other woman cloaked in secrecy until this very moment. It was not only rejection, it was erasure. And yet Andrew did not falter. He basked in the spectacle, his cruelty framed as righteousness. She, he said with deliberate emphasis, is worthy. She belongs, and she will stand beside me where you never could. The room erupted in outrage. Some guests muttered in disgust. Others hissed under their breath. The cruelty was too bare, too brazen. The very performance meant to elevate Andrew instead laid bare his rot, his hunger, his willingness to discard love for lineage, and still he stood unashamed. David's hand tightened briefly on Kaylee's shoulder, grounding her in the storm. His silence was not weakness, it was steel. His eyes burned with the knowledge that this boy, dressed in borrowed power and polished arrogance, had just revealed himself for what he truly was, small, pitiful, enslaved by his own ambition. Kaylee wanted to speak, to scream, to demand he look at her and remember the nights when love had seemed real, when she believed his heart beat only for her. But as she opened her mouth, words withered in her throat. What was left to say when a man revealed that love had never been enough? When he confessed before the world that another woman's pedigree outweighed her very soul? The ballroom became a courtroom, every guest a juror, every whisper a gavel striking down his character. Outrage burned in their eyes, though few dared voice it aloud. The humiliation was too raw, the wound too open. Callie stood as though carved from marble, her silence the only dignity she could salvage, while Andrew basked in the ruin he had orchestrated. The chandeliers glittered overhead, cruel in their brilliance, as though mocking the broken promises below. And as the last echo of Andrew's words settled into the marble and gold, a cliffhanger of silence held the room. Everyone knew the night was no longer a celebration. It was an execution of love, of trust, of illusion. The groom had not just ended an engagement, he had unveiled the death of his own soul. The ballroom was still vibrating with the echo of Andrew's cruel laughter when David finally stepped forward. Until now he had remained silent, the calm center of a storm that spun wildly around him. Guests had mistaken his stillness for weakness, his patience for passivity. But when he moved, the room seemed to shift. The chandeliers burned brighter, the whispers died mid-breath, and all eyes fell on the tall, silver-haired man with skin dark as polished oak and eyes that gleamed with a quiet fire. Andrew, flushed with the arrogance of his own performance, sneered at him. What now? You plan to lecture me? To shame me in my own celebration? His voice dripped disdain, his grin sharpened by triumph. You don't belong here. You never did. This night was already too generous. David's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of amusement, but of a man who knew truths too heavy to be shaken by insults. He stepped into the center of the ballroom, his cane tapping once against the marble floor, a sound so small it sliced the silence like a crack of thunder. When he spoke, his voice carried not in volume but in weight, a resonance that seemed to live in the walls themselves. You speak of generosity, David said slowly, his gaze fixed on Andrew, but you have lived your entire life borrowing from the generosity of others. You mock what you do not understand. You dismiss what you cannot fathom. And tonight, you reveal not my weakness but your own blindness. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some guests leaned forward, their eyes bright with hunger for scandal. Others recoiled, sensing something monumental about to unfold. Andrew let out a bitter laugh. Blindness? No. I see exactly what you are. A relic clinging to the arm of my bride-to-be. A man with nothing but stories of hardship and dignity. Tell me, what is dignity worth in a room like this? His words stung with condescension, each syllable dripping poison. David did not falter. His silver hair glowed beneath the chandeliers as he straightened his shoulders. Perhaps it is time, he said, for you to learn who stands before you. A pause held the room captive. The silence stretched so taut it could snap. And then, with deliberate clarity, he delivered the revelation. My name is David Ellington. I am the third-generation CEO of Ellington Oil, an empire that stretches across this country, that fuels your father's fragile company, that keeps half this state employed. Every drop of oil that powers your world flows through the legacy of my name. The words struck like an earthquake. Gasps broke from every corner of the ballroom. Champagne glasses rattled on silver trays. Whispers rose like a tide. Ellington Oil. The name alone was a monument. Even those who prided themselves on ignorance of business knew it. An empire of wealth, power, and influence, built brick by brick, barrel by barrel. And the man they had just ridiculed, the man they dismissed as an embarrassment, was its sovereign. Andrew's mother paled, her hand clutching at her pearls as though they might choke her. His father's lips parted, his face drained of color, but no words emerged. The guests stared, some stunned into silence, others exchanging frantic glances. But Andrew laughed. He laughed louder, crueler, his voice echoing off the marble walls. This is your trick, your little fable to save face. Do you think I would believe that the man standing here in a cheap Navy suit commands an empire worth billions? You insult me further by pretending. Ellington Oil, if you held such power, you wouldn't stand in this room begging for respect. You would own the very ground beneath our feet. His mockery rang false, even as it left his lips. But pride is a blinding poison. The more the crowd shifted, the more he dug into his disbelief. Do you all not see? He cried, turning to the guests, his arms wide, his voice pitched high with ridicule. He's spinning tales, a desperate old man weaving fantasies. And you lap it up like children at a puppet show. Look at him. Does this man look like the master of fortunes? Or does he look like a fraud with a story too grand to be true? The words were daggers flung carelessly, but they revealed more of Andrew's own fear than of David's truth. The guests did not laugh with him. Their silence was a verdict, a collective recoil from his arrogance. David stood unshaken. He let the mockery wash over him, his face calm, his eyes steady. Then, without breaking his gaze from Andrew, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, every gesture infused with authority. He pressed a single button, lifted the device to his ear, and spoke words that made the room tremble. "This is David Ellington," he said. "Pull out every cent from Harrington Enterprises, effective immediately. By dawn, not a single dollar remains." The chandeliers seemed to flicker at the force of it. Andrew's father staggered backward, his hand gripping the back of a chair as though the marble beneath him had turned to quicksand. His mother gasped, her face contorting between disbelief and horror. The guests whispered furiously, the sound rising into a storm. They knew this was no performance. Only a man with real power could sever fortunes with a phone call spoken so casually. Andrew, red-faced and furious, lashed out. "Do you all not see? It's theater. He's bluffing. He's mocking us. A clown playing king for the night. And you," his finger jabbed toward the crowd, "you fools fall for it." His laugh rang hollow, desperate. David slid the phone back into his pocket, his eyes never leaving Andrew. His voice was low, but it thundered through the hall. "You will learn soon enough. And when the morning comes, when your name crumbles with your fortune, you will remember this night. You will remember the moment you mocked the hand that fed you. And you will regret it until your last breath." The words hung in the air like a prophecy. With quiet dignity, David turned to Kaylee, resting his hand gently on her shoulder. Together, with their family, they walked toward the grand doors. Their departure was not flight, but victory, leaving behind a room fractured by truth. Andrew's laughter followed them, brittle, frantic, already unraveling. The chandeliers blazed above, merciless in their light, exposing the groom not as a victim, but as a fool who had spat in the face of power. And in that glittering ruin of a night, everyone knew the Harrington name would never recover from the arrogance on display. The sunlight streamed mercilessly through the tall glass windows of Andrew's penthouse, golden rays striking the marble floors like judgment. He lay sprawled on the sofa, tuxedo jacket discarded, his tie loosened, his head pounding from a night drowned in liquor and pride. He had convinced himself as he drifted into restless sleep that the storm would pass, that the murmurs and gasps of last night's humiliation would fade beneath the power of his family's name. The shrill ring of his phone shattered the fragile silence. He groaned, fumbling for it, irritation lacing his every movement. But the moment he pressed it to his ear, his body stiffened. "Andrew," came his father's voice, cracked and urgent. "It's done. Ellington Oil pulled everything. Every cent. We're hemorrhaging. The banks are calling. Partners are panicking. We're on the brink." Andrew sat upright, the world tilting around him. "What? That's impossible. It was an act, a bluff." "You can't mean—" "It wasn't a bluff," his father snapped, his tone a blend of terror and fury. "David Ellington made the call himself. I've confirmed it with the board. By morning we are ruined." The words slammed into him, rattling the fragile shield of denial he had built overnight. He rose to his feet, pacing across the marble, his reflection fractured in the panes of glass around him. "No," he muttered, voice shaking with disbelief. "This can't be happening. He can't have that kind of power. He's nothing. But even as the denial poured from his lips, the truth clawed at him. He remembered the old man's calm eyes, the steady voice that had spoken prophecy in front of hundreds of guests. By morning, not a single dollar remains. At the time, Andrew had laughed, dismissing it as theater. But theater does not dismantle empires overnight. Theater does not send his father into panic before dawn. He pressed a hand to his forehead, sweat beating despite the cool air. "There has to be a way to fix this," he said, more to himself than to his father. "Call them back. Negotiate. Offer concessions. We can't just let this stand." "You don't understand," his father replied, his voice low, almost broken. "We have no leverage. We were afloat because of Ellington's money. Without it, everything collapses." The line went dead, but the silence that followed was worse than shouting. Andrew dropped the phone, his pulse racing. The headlines had already begun to roll across financial feeds. Harrington Enterprises faces crisis after Ellington withdrawal. Reporters speculated about bankruptcy, about the death of a dynasty. Investors fled like rats from a sinking ship. The empire his family had built on glittering facades and borrowed strength crumbled in real time. He sank into the sofa, his chest heaving, and whispered the words he swore he'd never speak. He was right. The admission burned like acid. David's calm warning echoed in his skull. You will regret this night. Andrew shot to his feet, seizing his phone once more, dialing the only number he thought could save him. Each ring clawed at his nerves until at last her voice answered, steady, distant, colder than the morning light. Kaylee, he gasped, his desperation pouring through the line. Listen to me. Last night it was madness. I didn't mean it. I was pressured, angry. I love you. You know I love you. This is all a misunderstanding. Let's forget it. Let's go through with the wedding. Silence answered him, waited, suffocating. And then, her voice clear, sharp, unyielding. No, Andrew. What you called madness was the truth. You showed me who you are. I saw it in your words, in your eyes, in the way you mocked my family and betrayed my love. That wasn't a mistake. That was you. His knees weakened, his free hand clutching the sofa as though to anchor himself. You don't mean that. You can't. We're meant to be together. I'll make it right. I'll fix it. Stop. She cut him off, a voice like steel. Love does not beg for dignity. Love does not survive cruelty. You didn't lose me because of David's power. You lost me because of your own pride. What you're facing now, you brought upon yourself. We are finished. The line clicked dead. Andrew stood frozen, the phone still pressed against his ear, though the silence was absolute. The city stretched before him through glass walls, indifferent, alive with motion while his world collapsed. His breath came ragged, his chest constricted. He wanted to scream, to call again, to undo with words what his actions had carved in stone. But the truth pressed against him with crushing weight. There was no undoing. And for the first time in his life, Andrew Harrington understood what it meant to be powerless. The morning light did not greet Andrew Harrington with its usual golden warmth. Instead, it sliced through the blinds like cold knives, illuminating a man who looked nothing like the Prince of Wall Street from yesterday's headlines. He sat slumped in his leather chair, his suit rumpled, his tie undone, his hands trembling around a glass of whiskey, though the clock had barely passed 9. The silence was unnerving. His office had once been a symphony of ringing phones, typing assistants, and urgent footsteps of men eager to please him. Now, only the muted hum of the air conditioning remained, a mechanical reminder that the world outside carried on without him. Then came the call. His phone buzzed, the screen flashing a name that once meant salvation. Livingston Capital, his last great investor, his final lifeline. Andrew lunged for it, desperate, pressing it to his ear as though the device itself might forgive him. But the voice was cold, measured, merciless. Mr. Harrington, effective immediately, we're withdrawing all commitments. Your credit lines are closed. Our board has decided your company is a liability we cannot afford. The words crashed into him like steel doors slamming shut. He stammered, begged, promised, but the call ended with a click so sharp it felt like a guillotine. And in that silence total, suffocating silence, he realized the empire he had once worn like armor had not been stripped from him by force. He had bartered it away himself, piece by piece, in the currency of arrogance. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and the memories came like phantoms circling a dying man. Kaylee, standing in the glow of candles at their engagement party, her smile trembling as his family's voices cut her down with cruelty disguised as charm. He had joined them, sneering at her heritage, dismissing her grace as if her love was something he could return for a newer model. He remembered the gasps of the guests when he unveiled his hidden lover, parading her as a prize more worthy of his family name. He remembered Kaylee's silence, her dignity, her eyes like broken glass holding back a storm, and then the old man, her grandfather, rising from his seat with the kind of authority that money could never purchase. His words had rung out, steady and final. One day, you will choke on your pride, and when you do, you will remember this night. At the time, Andrew had smirked, convinced it was a bluff. He believed money answered every challenge, that power made him untouchable. Yet here he was, in the ashes, tasting the bitter truth. The old man had not cursed him. He had simply told the future. The papers had crucified him in public, but it was in private that the true punishment unfolded. Friends he had once dined with avoided his calls. The women who once draped themselves across his arm now pretended not to know him. Even his own family, whose cruel approval he had once fought for, turned on him with the same venom they had used on Callie. But none of it hurt, like the memory of her voice on the phone when he called in desperation. He had pleaded, promising it was all a misunderstanding, begging to start over. And she had answered calm and resolute. Andrew, we're finished. What you lost, you destroyed yourself. This isn't punishment, it's consequence. She hung up before he could reply, leaving him suspended in a silence heavier than any courtroom verdict. Now, as he sat in the ruins of his office, he finally understood the depth of what he had lost. Not just money, not just reputation. He had lost the woman who might have saved him, not from ruin, but from himself. He rose unsteadily and walked to the window. The city stretched before him, glittering, alive, a metropolis that no longer whispered his name. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, staring at the skyscrapers he once believed he ruled. They stood tall, indifferent, as if mocking the fragility of his rise and fall. For the first time, Andrew Harrington saw himself clearly, not as a titan, not as a king, but as a cautionary tale. His reflection was a stranger, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched, the lines of arrogance etched deep like scars. He had thought pride was a crown. Now he saw it for what it truly was, a noose. If only, he whispered, his voice breaking, if only I hadn't been blind. But regret is a cruel teacher, arriving always too late. He could not step back into that engagement hall and choose love over vanity. He could not silence his family's venom, nor unspeak the words that had cut Callie to the bone. And he could not rebuild what had been willingly burned. Somewhere across the city he imagined her, Callie, radiant, stepping into a future free of him, perhaps laughing with someone who saw her worth without needing proof of her family's fortune, perhaps preparing to walk down the aisle toward a man who would never mistake arrogance for strength. And in that vision, Andrew saw not just the life he had lost, but the man he could have been, the man Callie had believed in before he drowned him in greed. The office lights flickered, the power company's final insult, a reminder that even electricity was now a luxury slipping away. Alone in the shadows, Andrew Harrington finally bowed his head. Not to investors, not to critics, not to his family's sneers, but to the weight of his own failure. The truth was seared into him. He had not been destroyed by fate. He had been undone by choice. And that truth, merciless and permanent, was the only inheritance he had left. Life doesn't always break us with storms. Sometimes it whispers the truth in silence. Andrew once believed he had it all: money, power, and the approval of a family that measured worth by last names and bank accounts. But arrogance is fragile. It looks like a crown until the moment it cracks, and then it cuts deeper than any blade. On the night of his engagement, Andrew stood not as a man in love, but as a man desperate to protect his pride. He mocked the woman who had given him her heart, sneered at her family, and let cruelty parade as confidence. For a few fleeting moments, he thought he looked strong. But when the truth unfolded, when her grandfather revealed himself as the man whose empire sustained Andrew's own future, the mask shattered. By morning, the walls closed in. Investors vanished, his company trembled, and the Harrington name that had once glittered in society's circles began to dissolve into dust. Andrew tried to rewind time, to reach for Callie again, but what was broken could not be pieced back together. She had already seen the truth. Love cannot breathe where respect has been suffocated. What makes Andrew's fall so haunting is not just what he lost, but how he lost it. Not to fate, not to misfortune, but to himself. Every word he spat, every sneer he allowed, every moment he chose pride over tenderness laid the stones on the path that led him here. By the time he realized, the door had already closed. And maybe that is why his story lingers. Not because it teaches, but because it reminds us. People don't remember the titles we hold or the fortunes we claim. They remember how we treated them when it mattered. For Andrew, the cruel echo of that night will follow him longer than any headline or balance sheet. If this is your first time visiting our channel, or if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And tell us in the comments what stayed with you most from Andrew's fall. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your feelings, your perspective. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video, where another story waits to remind us how fragile and how powerful the human heart